Two police officers cornered a 78-year-old black man in a grocery store parking lot, accusing him of theft. They mocked him when he said he was just buying milk for his grandkids. One officer even reached for his handcuffs, ready to arrest him on the spot. But then one of them noticed something glinting around the old man's neck. A necklace, a simple chain with a medal attached. And in that moment, everything changed. What happened next didn't just leave both officers speechless, it ended one of their careers. This is a story about respect, prejudice, and the moment a decorated war hero reminded two cops exactly who they were dealing with. James Carter was 78 years old, but he didn't feel it most days. Sure, his knees ached when the weather changed, sending sharp reminders up his legs that made him wince when he stood too quickly. His back complained when he lifted anything heavier than a gallon of milk. A dull throb that settled in his lower spine and refused to leave. His hands, once steady enough to field strip a rifle blindfolded, now trembled slightly when he held a pen for too long. But his mind was sharp as ever. His spirit remained unbroken, weathered but resilient, like an old oak tree that had survived countless storms. And his routine, that was unwavering. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, James would wake up at 6:30. He'd make himself a simple breakfast, 2 eggs scrambled, a slice of wheat toast, and black coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He'd read the newspaper cover to cover, taking his time with the obituaries, always checking to see if any old friends had passed. Too many had over the years. After breakfast, he'd shower, dress in his usual attire, clean jeans, a button-down shirt or a simple jacket, and a pair of worn but well-maintained sneakers. And by 9 o'clock he'd be in his old Buick heading to the grocery store. It wasn't the closest store to his house. There was a newer, shinier supermarket just 3 miles away, with better prices and wider aisles. But James didn't go there. He drove the extra 7 miles to Morrison's Family Grocery, the same store he'd been visiting for the past 15 years. It wasn't about convenience. It wasn't even about the selection. It was about familiarity, about routine, about the small human connections that made life feel a little less lonely after Margaret died. The cashiers at Morrison's knew him by name. Linda, who worked the express lane, always asked about his grandchildren. Marcus, the young man who bagged groceries, called him Colonel and thanked him for his service every single time. Even the store manager, Mr. Hutchinson, would stop to chat whenever he saw James, asking about his garden or recommending a new brand of coffee. For James, these interactions mattered. They were threads that connected him to the world, kept him from becoming invisible in his old age. James Carter was a retired Marine Corps colonel. That wasn't something he advertised, wasn't something he wore like a badge of honor in everyday conversation. But it was the foundation of who he was. He'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, leading men through some of the most brutal combat of the war. He'd been barely 23 when he first set foot in that jungle, young and idealistic, and convinced he was fighting for something greater than himself. By the time he came home 6 years later, he was a different man, harder, quieter, carrying scars both visible and hidden. The visible scar was on his left side, just below his ribs, a jagged line of tissue where shrapnel had torn through him during an ambush in 1969. He'd been leading a patrol through dense jungle when the explosion hit, ripping through the vegetation and sending hot metal fragments in every direction. 3 of his men died instantly. James took shrapnel to his torso and kept moving, kept fighting, kept leading the survivors to safety, even as blood soaked through his uniform. He'd nearly died that day. The field medic told him later that if the shrapnel had hit 3 inches to the right, it would have punctured his liver, and that would have been the end of Colonel James Carter. But it hadn't. He survived. And for that act of courage under fire, for leading his men to safety despite his injuries, he was awarded the Purple Heart. The invisible scars were harder to explain. They were the nightmares that still woke him up some nights, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the sound of helicopters still echoing in his ears. They were the moments of silence that would overtake him without warning, when a loud noise or a certain smell would transport him back to the jungle. They were the names he couldn't forget: Private Rodriguez, Sergeant O'Brien, Corporal Washington, men who'd died under his command, whose faces he still saw when he closed his eyes. When James came home from Vietnam in 1971, Margaret was waiting for him. They'd married just before his first deployment, and she'd written him letters every single week he was overseas. She was his anchor, his reason for surviving. She held him when he woke up screaming. She sat with him in silence when the words wouldn't come. She never judged him, never pushed him to be someone he wasn't anymore. She just loved him, unconditionally and completely. Margaret was the one who found his Purple Heart tucked away in a shoebox in the back of their closet, 5 years after he'd come home. He'd put it there and tried to forget about it, tried to forget about everything that medal represented. But Margaret wouldn't let him forget. She took the medal to a jeweler and had it mounted on a silver chain, converting it into a necklace. When she gave it to him on their 10th wedding anniversary, she'd said, "You earned this, James. You bled for this. Don't you dare hide it away like you're ashamed. Wear it. Wear it so you never forget who you are. Wear it so you never forget what you survived." He'd protested at first. It felt too much like showing off, like demanding recognition for things he'd rather forget. But Margaret insisted, and eventually he gave in. He wore the necklace every day, through raising 3 children, through promotions and retirements, through Margaret's long battle with cancer that finally took her 4 years ago. Even now, with her gone and the house too quiet and too empty, he wore it, because it reminded him, not just of the war, not just of the men he'd lost, but of her belief in him, of her insistence that he was worth more than his worst memories. The town James lived in was suburban Virginia, quiet and tree-lined, with neat lawns and good schools, and a main street full of local businesses that had somehow survived the invasion of chain stores. The population was predominantly white, had been for as long as James had lived there, but that had never been a problem. Or at least it had never seemed like a problem. People were polite. They smiled and nodded when they passed him on the street. Some were genuinely friendly, stopping to chat about the weather or local news. James was one of the few black regulars at Morrison's family grocery. There were others, of course. The town wasn't entirely homogeneous, but on any given Saturday morning he might be the only black face in the store. That had never bothered him before. He'd never felt unwelcome, never felt like he was being watched or judged. The employees treated him with respect, even warmth. The other customers were courteous. In 15 years of shopping there, he'd never had a single negative experience, until today. James's weekly shopping list never varied much. He bought the basics: bread, eggs, butter, cereal, coffee, and milk. Always milk. 3 cartons to be specific. 1 for each of his grandchildren: Marcus Jr., who was 12, Keisha, who was 9, and little Davin, who'd just turned 6. They visited every Sunday afternoon, and James always made sure he had fresh milk for them. He'd pour them each a glass and watch them drink it down, and in those moments he felt connected to something larger than himself, to family, to the future, to hope. This particular Saturday morning was beautiful. Early autumn, the air crisp but not cold, the leaves just beginning to turn gold and red. James arrived at Morrison's at 9:15, parked his Buick in his usual spot near the back of the lot, under the shade of an old oak tree. He preferred parking away from the store entrance, away from the crowds. Less chance of someone dinging his car door, and the walk was good for his knees, kept them from stiffening up too much. He grabbed a cart and went inside. The store was moderately busy, but not crowded. A handful of early morning shoppers pushing their carts up and down the aisles, the overhead lights humming softly, the faint sound of pop music playing from speakers somewhere near the deli counter. James moved through his routine efficiently. Bread from aisle 3, eggs from the dairy section, butter, cereal, coffee, and then, finally, milk. He stood in front of the refrigerated case, looking at the rows of gallon jugs. Whole milk, 2%, skim, almond milk, oat milk. The options had multiplied over the years, but James always bought the same thing. Whole milk, store brand, which happened to be on sale this week, 2 for $5. He grabbed 3 cartons, placed them in his cart, and headed to the checkout. Linda was working the express lane, and she smiled when she saw him approach. "Good morning, Colonel Carter. How are you today?" "Morning, Linda. Can't complain. How's your daughter doing?" "She's great. Started her sophomore year at community college, studying nursing. That's wonderful. You must be proud. I am. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Linda rang up his items one by one, and James paid in cash, as he always did. She handed him his receipt, and Marcus appeared to bag his groceries. Morning, Colonel, Marcus said, carefully placing the eggs in a separate bag. Thanks for your service, sir. Thank you, Marcus. You take care. James took his 2 bags and headed toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and he stepped out into the sunshine, feeling good, feeling normal. He had no idea that in the next 10 minutes, everything would change. James walked across the parking lot at a measured pace, careful not to rush. His knees didn't appreciate sudden movements anymore, and the paper bags were heavier than they looked. The morning sun was warm on his face, and he could hear birds singing in the trees that lined the edge of the parking lot. It was peaceful, ordinary, just another Saturday morning. His Buick was parked about 50 yards from the store entrance, tucked under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree that provided blessed shade, even on the hottest summer days. James had been parking in this same general area for years. He liked the walk. It gave him time to think, time to breathe, time to appreciate the simple fact that he was still alive and mobile and capable of taking care of himself. He was about halfway to his car when he heard it. A voice, sharp, authoritative, cutting through the peaceful morning air like a knife. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" James stopped mid-step, confused. He turned around, his hands tightening slightly on the grocery bags. A police cruiser had pulled into the parking lot behind him, its engine still running, but its lights off. 2 police officers were getting out, both white men, both wearing the dark blue uniforms of the local police department. The first officer was in his mid-30s, stocky and broad-shouldered, with short cropped brown hair and a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted into an expression of suspicion and authority. His nameplate read, Mason. He walked toward James with the kind of swagger that suggested he enjoyed the power his badge gave him, enjoyed the way people deferred to him, moved out of his way, did what he told them to do. The second officer was younger, probably in his late 20s, leaner and taller, with sandy blonde hair and a face that looked uncertain, almost uncomfortable. His nameplate read, Brennan. He hung back slightly, one hand resting on his belt, watching his partner with an expression that James couldn't quite read. Hesitation, maybe, or doubt. James set his grocery bags down on the asphalt beside him and straightened up, meeting Officer Mason's gaze directly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and measured. He'd learned a long time ago that tone mattered in situations like this. Stay calm, stay respectful, don't give them a reason to escalate. Officer Mason didn't answer right away. He stopped about 5 feet in front of James, looked him up and down with an expression that made James feel like he was being sized up, evaluated, judged. Mason hooked his thumbs into his belt, a gesture that was probably meant to look casual, but came across as aggressive. "We got a report," Mason said finally. "Shoplifting. Black male. About your age, about your build. Left the store just a few minutes ago." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "You mind showing me your receipt?" James felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly. He'd faced worse things than an aggressive cop, but something else. A familiar, weary recognition. He'd lived through this before, in different forms, in different contexts. The assumption, the suspicion, the way his skin color became the most important thing about him, eclipsing everything else. His service, his character, his humanity. But he kept his composure. He'd survived 3 tours in Vietnam. He could survive this. "Of course," James said quietly. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. The last thing he needed was for this officer to think he was reaching for a weapon. "Easy," Mason barked, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, toward his gun, "hands where I can see them." James froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. He looked at Mason, saw the tension in the man's posture, the way his fingers hovered near his weapon. For a moment, James wondered if this was it, if this was how his story would end, not in a jungle in Vietnam, Not in a hospital bed surrounded by family, but here, in a grocery store parking lot, shot because he reached for a receipt. "I'm just getting my receipt," James said slowly, carefully. "It's in my jacket pocket." Mason's jaw tightened. Slow, real slow. James moved with exaggerated care, pulling the folded receipt from his pocket and holding it up so Mason could see it. Mason stepped forward and snatched it from James's hand without a word, barely glancing at the printed text before handing it back. "This could be fake," Mason said with a shrug as if he was discussing the weather. "You mind if we check your bags?" James took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He could feel his heart rate increasing, could feel the old familiar anger starting to rise in his chest, hot and heavy, but he pushed it down. He'd learned a long time ago that anger didn't help in situations like this. Anger just gave them an excuse. "I paid for everything, officer," James said, keeping his voice even. "I've been shopping at this store for 15 years. The cashier knows me. The manager knows me. You can go inside and ask them." Mason's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more skeptical, like James's words had only confirmed his suspicions. "Sure you have," he said, and there was a smirk in his voice, a condescension that made James's hands clench involuntarily. "I've heard that before. Open the bags." By this point, other shoppers had started to notice. A woman pushing a cart toward her minivan slowed down, craning her neck to see what was happening. An elderly couple stopped on the sidewalk near the store entrance, whispering to each other. A young man in gym clothes pulled out his phone, holding it up, clearly recording. James could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their pity. He hated it, hated being made into a spectacle, hated being reduced to this, an old black man being publicly humiliated in a parking lot. But he did what he was told. What choice did he have? He bent down, his knees protesting, and opened the paper bags, standing back up slowly. Officer Mason stepped forward and, without asking permission, began pulling items out of the bags. He didn't hand them to James. He didn't set them gently aside. He just tossed them one by one onto the hood of James's Buick. The bread landed with a soft thud. The cereal box hit the metal with a hollow sound. The carton of eggs, thank God they were in a protective container, clattered as it landed. James watched, his jaw tight, his hands at his sides. Each item that hit the hood of his car felt like another small humiliation, another small violation of his dignity. Mason picked up the 3 cartons of milk, holding them up like they were evidence in a criminal trial. He turned one of them around, reading the label, then looked at James with an expression of smug satisfaction. "These were on sale," Mason said. 2 for $5, limit 2 per customer." He held up the 3 cartons. "You've got 3 here." James met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I have 3 grandchildren," he said simply. 3 kids, 3 cartons of milk, 1 for each of them. Mason's smirk widened. "Rules are rules, old man. You can't just ignore the limit because it's inconvenient." James felt something snap inside him, just a little. "The cashier rang them up," he said, and there was an edge to his voice now, a sharpness he couldn't quite suppress. "She saw 3 cartons. She didn't say anything. The system didn't flag it. I paid for them. There's no theft here." Mason set the milk down on the hood, crossing his arms. "Maybe. Maybe not. But breaking store policy, that's suspicious behavior. Makes me wonder what else you might be trying to get away with." Officer Brennan shifted his weight, and for the first time, he spoke up. His voice was quieter than Mason's, less aggressive. "Derek," he said, glancing at his partner, "the receipt checks out. He paid for everything. Maybe we should just—" "I'll decide when we're done here," Mason snapped, cutting him off without even looking at him. His tone made it clear that he wasn't interested in Brennan's opinion, wasn't interested in anything except asserting his authority. Brennan fell silent, but James saw the way his jaw tightened, saw the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. The younger officer knew this was wrong. He might not have had the courage to stop it, but he knew. The crowd around them had grown. Maybe a dozen people now, standing at a careful distance but close enough to hear every word. Several of them had their phones out, recording. James could see the little red dots indicating that they were live streaming, broadcasting this humiliation in real time to hundreds, maybe thousands of strangers. Mason noticed the phones too, and it seemed to make him more defensive, more aggressive, like he needed to prove he was in control. He stepped closer to James, invading his personal space, and James could smell the coffee on his breath. "You got ID on you?" Mason demanded. James kept his voice steady. "I don't need to show you ID for buying groceries." Mason's expression darkened. "You refusing to cooperate? That's obstruction, old man. I can arrest you for that. Is that what you want?" James said nothing. He just stood there, his back straight despite the ache in his spine, his hands at his sides, his gaze level. He'd faced down enemy soldiers. He'd stared death in the face more times than he could count. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a bully with a badge. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Mason, red-faced and aggressive, trying to assert dominance. James, calm and dignified, refusing to be diminished. And then Mason reached for his handcuffs. The metallic clink of the handcuffs was unmistakable. Officer Mason pulled them from his belt with a practiced motion, the steel glinting in the morning sunlight. The sound seemed to echo across the parking lot, and James felt the crowd around them collectively hold its breath. Officer Brennan took a half-step forward, his hand rising slightly as if he wanted to reach out and stop his partner. "Derek," he said again, and there was urgency in his voice now, an edge of warning. "Come on, man, this isn't—" "I said I'll handle it," Mason snapped, not even looking at Brennan. His eyes were locked on James, and there was something in his expression that went beyond professional detachment. It was personal now. James had challenged him, had refused to be intimidated, and Mason couldn't let that stand, not in front of an audience. "Turn around," Mason ordered, taking another step closer to James. "Hands behind your back." James didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his gaze steady, his breathing controlled. Inside, his mind was racing, calculating options, measuring risks. He knew how this could go. He'd seen it play out on the news too many times. An older black man, a confrontation with police, a sudden movement misinterpreted as a threat. He'd survived a war. He'd survived shrapnel and bullets and explosions. He'd be damned if he was going to die in a grocery store parking lot because of a power-hungry cop with something to prove. But he also knew he couldn't just comply, because complying meant letting this man rob him of his dignity. Complying meant accepting the premise that he was a criminal, that he'd done something wrong, that his 78 years on this earth and his decades of service to his country meant nothing in the face of this man's prejudice. "No," James said quietly. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mason blinked, clearly not having expected that response. "What did you say?" "I said no," James repeated, his voice stronger now. "I haven't done anything wrong. I paid for my groceries. I showed you my receipt. I complied with your request to check my bags. I've done everything you've asked, but I'm not turning around so you can arrest me for the crime of buying milk while black." A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God." The phones stayed up, recording every second. Mason's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment mixing together. "You're resisting—" "I'm not resisting," James interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now, the voice of a man who'd commanded troops under fire. "I'm standing still. I'm not threatening you. I'm not reaching for anything. I'm just refusing to let you violate my rights." "Your rights?" Mason's voice rose. "I'm conducting an investigation. You're interfering with—" "What investigation?" James asked. "You said you had a report of shoplifting. Who made that report? What's the complainant's name? What specific items were allegedly stolen?" Mason's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer. "There was no report," James continued, his voice calm but relentless. "You saw an old black man walking to his car with grocery bags, and you made an assumption. You assumed I was a criminal. You assumed I was stealing. And when I proved I wasn't, when I showed you the receipt, you couldn't admit you were wrong. So you invented a new violation. The milk. The store policy. Anything to justify what you'd already decided about me before you even got out of your car." The crowd murmured in agreement. Several people called out, "That's right. And leave him alone." Mason's hand moved to his radio, probably to call for backup, but Brennan stepped forward and put a hand on his partner's arm. "Derek," he said quietly, "we need to de-escalate, now." "Get your hand off me," Mason growled. Brennan didn't move. "Look around, man, everyone's recording. This is already bad. If you arrest him now for nothing, you're going to be on every news channel in the country by tonight." Mason glared at him but didn't pull away. James took a slow breath, and his mind drifted unbidden to another time, another place, another moment when he'd stood his ground against people who wanted to diminish him. Vietnam, 1969. He'd been a captain then, not yet a colonel. His unit had been pinned down in a rice paddy, taking heavy fire from 3 sides. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. The radio operator was screaming for air support, but the helicopters couldn't land in the crossfire. They were sitting ducks. James had looked at his men, most of them younger than 25, most of them terrified, and he'd made a decision. He couldn't save them all, but he could save some of them. He'd organized a fighting retreat, laying down suppressing fire while small groups ran for the tree line. He'd been the last one out, carrying Private Rodriguez over his shoulder, the young man's blood soaking through both their uniforms. They'd made it to the tree line. Barely. Out of 30 men, 22 survived. 8 didn't. James carried the weight of those 8 names every single day. He thought about Private O'Brien, who'd been 22 years old, from Boston, who talked constantly about his girlfriend back home and how he was going to marry her as soon as his tour was up. O'Brien had taken a bullet to the chest 30 feet from safety. James had watched the light go out of his eyes. He thought about Sergeant Washington, 38 years old, a lifer who'd survived 2 previous tours and should have been rotated home months earlier. Washington had thrown himself on a grenade to save 3 younger soldiers. James had been the one to write the letter to his widow. He thought about Corporal Chen, who'd been a translator, who'd saved their lives more times than James could count by talking to local villagers and gathering intelligence. Chen had been killed by friendly fire, shot by another American unit that had panicked and fired at anything that moved. 3 weeks after the rice paddy incident, James had been wounded. Shrapnel from an explosion that had killed 3 more of his men. He'd been medevaced out, spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Japan, and then been sent back. Because that's what you did. You survived and then you went back. When he'd finally come home in 1971, he'd been a different person, harder, quieter, haunted by the faces of men he couldn't save. Margaret had understood. She hadn't tried to fix him. She'd just loved him. She'd held him when he woke up screaming. She'd sat with him in silence when the words wouldn't come. And she'd been the one to pull his purple heart out of that shoebox and insist that he wear it. "You earned this," she'd said. "You bled for this country. You nearly died for this country. Don't hide it. Don't hide who you are. Wear it so you remember. Wear it so the world knows what you've given." James reached up now unconsciously and touched his chest, feeling the outline of the medal through his shirt. The Purple Heart, his proof of service, his reminder of what he'd survived. And standing in this parking lot, facing down a man who wanted to put him in handcuffs for the crime of being black in public, James made a decision. The same kind of decision he'd made in that rice paddy 56 years ago. He wasn't going to run, he wasn't going to hide, and he damn sure wasn't going to let this man take his dignity. "Officer Mason," James said, and his voice carried across the parking lot, clear and strong. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I'm 78 years old. I've lived through things you can't even imagine. I've earned my place in this world, and I'm not going to let you treat me like a criminal because of the color of my skin." Mason opened his mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. "I know men like you," James continued. "I've met them all my life. Men who see a black face and make assumptions. Men who think a badge gives them the right to treat people like they're less than human. Men who hide their prejudice behind words like procedure and policy and investigation. Now wait just a—" Mason started. "I'm not finished," James said, and there was command in his voice now, the unmistakable authority of a man who'd led soldiers into combat. "You've accused me of theft. You've checked my receipt and found nothing. You've searched my bags and found nothing. You've invented a violation about milk cartons that the store didn't even enforce. And now you want to arrest me because I won't meekly submit to your harassment." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. "So I'm going to ask you a question, Officer Mason, and I want you to answer it honestly, if you're capable of honesty. If I were a white man, 78 years old, walking to my car with grocery bags, would you have stopped me? Would you have accused me of theft? Would you have dumped my groceries on my car and threatened to arrest me?" Mason said nothing. His face was red, his jaw clenched so tight James could see the muscles jumping. "We both know the answer," James said quietly. "And so does everyone here." A white woman in her 50s stepped forward from the crowd. She was dressed in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "He's right," she called out, pointing at Mason. "I've been shopping here for years. I've seen this man before. He's always polite, always respectful. And I've never once seen a police officer stop a white customer in this parking lot. Not once." "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," Mason said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "The hell it doesn't," the woman shot back. "This is my community too, and I won't stand by and watch you harass an innocent person." Others in the crowd murmured agreement. An older white man called out, "Leave him alone." A younger black woman shouted, "This is racial profiling, we're all witnessing it." Mason looked around, seeming to realize for the first time just how bad this looked. His hand hovered near his handcuffs, but he didn't move to put them on James. He was trapped, caught between his ego and the growing realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. Brennan stepped closer to his partner. "Derek," he said, his voice low but urgent, "we need to end this. Now. Before it gets worse." "I'm not just going to—" "Yes, you are," Brennan interrupted. "Look around. We have no evidence, no complainant, no crime, and about 50 witnesses with cameras. If you arrest this man, it's on you, not me. I'm not going to back you up on this." Mason's face went from red to pale. He looked at James, then at the crowd, then at his handcuffs. For a long moment he seemed frozen, unable to decide what to do. And then, without saying another word, he clipped the handcuffs back onto his belt. But he wasn't done. He couldn't just walk away without having the last word, without trying to save face. He pointed at James. "You're lucky," he said. "Real lucky. But if I see you around here again, if there's even a hint of trouble, I'll be watching." James met his gaze without flinching. "I'll be here every Saturday, Officer Mason. Same as I've been for the past 15 years, buying groceries, minding my own business. And if you want to waste your time watching a 78-year-old man buy milk, that's your choice." Mason's jaw tightened, but he had nothing left to say. He turned and stalked back to his patrol car, yanking the door open with more force than necessary. Brennan hesitated for a moment, looking at James with an expression that might have been shame, might have been respect, might have been both. "Sir," Brennan said quietly, I'm sorry." James just nodded. Brennan turned and followed his partner to the car. The cruiser pulled out of the parking lot, disappearing down the street. For a moment after the police car disappeared, nobody moved. The crowd stood frozen, phones still raised, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. James stood by his car, breathing deeply, trying to slow his racing heart. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline, from the effort it had taken to stay calm, to stay controlled, to not give Mason the satisfaction of seeing him break. Then the store manager burst out of the entrance, practically running across the parking lot. Gerald Hutchinson was in his late 50s, balding, with glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He'd managed Morrison's family grocery for as long as James had been shopping there, and they'd always had a cordial relationship. Right now, Hutchinson looked panicked. "Colonel Carter," he called out as he approached. "Colonel Carter, I am so sorry. I just heard what happened. One of my cashiers saw it through the window and came to get me, but by the time I got out here—" He stopped, breathing hard, looking at James with genuine distress. "Are you okay?" James took a moment before answering. Was he okay? Physically, yes. Emotionally, that was harder to answer. "I'm fine, Gerald," he said finally. "Just another day in America." Hutchinson winced at the bitterness in James's tone. "I don't know what to say. I can't believe... Those officers had no right..." "It's not your fault," James said, though part of him wondered if that was entirely true. Would this have happened if Morrison's was in a different neighborhood, if the customer base was more diverse, if there'd been better training, better awareness, better something? But Hutchinson was a good man, and blaming him wouldn't change anything. The woman in the yoga outfit approached, still holding her phone. "Sir," she said to James, "I recorded the whole thing. I'm going to post it online if that's okay with you. People need to see this." James hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no, wanted to keep this private, wanted to avoid the attention, but he thought about his grandchildren, about Marcus Jr. and Keisha and little Davin, about what kind of world they were growing up in, about whether anything would ever change if people kept quiet about these things. "Yes," he said. "Post it. People should see." The woman nodded and immediately began typing on her phone. Others in the crowd came forward, offering support, expressing outrage, asking if there was anything they could do. An elderly couple introduced themselves as the Petersons, said they'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and had never seen anything like this. The store manager came rushing out, having been alerted by one of the employees who'd seen the commotion. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses, and the moment he saw James standing there with 2 police officers, his face went from confusion to alarm to outright fury. "Colonel Carter," he said, hurrying over. "What's going on here?" James gestured toward Mason. "These officers seem to think I'm a shoplifter." The manager turned to Mason, and his expression was one of pure disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "This man is a decorated war hero. He's been shopping here for over a decade. He's one of the most respected customers we have. What the hell is going on?" Mason stammered, trying to find words that would make this better. We received a report, a call about—" "What report?" the manager interrupted. "I've been inside the entire time. No one called in a shoplifting report. Who told you that?" Mason had no answer. The lie was exposed, hanging in the air between them like a bad smell. One of the bystanders, an older man with his phone still raised, called out, "This is going viral, officer. Hope your boss sees this." Mason's face went from pale to red. "Sir," he said, turning back to James, desperation creeping into his voice, "if there's been a misunderstanding—" "There's no misunderstanding," James said, his voice calm but firm. "You saw an old black man in a parking lot and you assumed the worst. You didn't see a veteran. You didn't see a grandfather. You didn't see a human being. You saw a color and you made a decision. That's not a misunderstanding, officer. That's prejudice." The words hit like a hammer. Mason had nothing to say. Brennan looked down at his shoes, ashamed. The manager put a hand on James's shoulder. "Colonel, I am so sorry. This never should have happened. Please let me help you with your groceries, and I want to make this right." James shook his head. "I don't need help with my groceries. I just need to be treated like a person." He bent down, picked up his bags, and began placing the items back inside one by one. The crowd watched in silence. Some people were crying. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A young black boy, maybe 10 years old, stood next to his mother, his eyes wide as he watched James move with quiet dignity. James finished packing his bags, stood up, and looked at the boy. For a moment, their eyes met. James gave him a small nod. The boy nodded back. Then James walked to his car, opened the trunk, placed his groceries inside, and drove away. The video went viral within hours. By that evening, it had millions of views. By the next morning, it was on the news. National outlets picked it up. "Decorated Marine veteran racially profiled by police," the headlines read. "Viral video shows officer harassing war hero over groceries." The police department issued a statement calling the incident deeply troubling and promising a full investigation. Officer Derek Mason was placed on administrative leave pending review. Officer Tim Brennan was required to undergo mandatory bias training, but that wasn't the end of it. As investigators dug deeper, they found that this wasn't Mason's first complaint. Over the past 7 years, there had been 12 formal complaints filed against him, most involving alleged racial profiling or excessive use of force. All of them had been dismissed or buried under administrative red tape. But now, with national attention on the case, those complaints resurfaced. The department could no longer ignore them. 2 weeks after the incident, Derek Mason was formally reprimanded. His history of misconduct was made public, and under mounting pressure from the community, he resigned. He didn't go quietly. He claimed he was being made a scapegoat, that he'd only been doing his job. But no one was listening anymore. The damage to his reputation was irreversible. Tim Brennan, on the other hand, took a different path. He reached out to James privately, asking if he could apologize in person. James agreed, and Brennan came to his home one evening, hat in hand, visibly shaken. He apologized, not with excuses, but with genuine remorse. He told James that the incident had forced him to confront his own biases, his own complicity in a system that had failed. James listened, then told him, "You can't undo what happened, but you can make sure it never happens again. Not on your watch." Brennan promised he would. The community rallied around James. The grocery store where the incident occurred renamed their veteran discount program in his honor, calling it the Colonel Carter Honor Program. The mayor issued a formal apology and presented James with a key to the city at a town hall meeting. James stood at the podium looking out at the crowd and spoke with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in that parking lot. "I don't want recognition," he said. "I don't need a key to a city I've lived in for decades. What I want, what I need, is change. I want the next old black man who goes to buy groceries to be treated with respect. I want the next young black woman who's walking to her car to not be assumed a criminal. I want my grandchildren to grow up in a world where their skin color doesn't determine how they're treated. That's what I want. That's what we all deserve." The room erupted in applause. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes. James stepped down from the podium, shook a few hands, and went home. Sunday afternoon came, as it always did. James's grandchildren arrived just after lunch, bounding through the front door with the kind of energy only kids can have. They hugged him, asked him what snacks he had, and settled in at the kitchen table while James poured them each a glass of milk. 3 cartons, 1 for each of them, just like always. His daughter, who'd driven them over, pulled him aside in the hallway. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you okay? After everything that happened?" James smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and strength. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I've been through worse." "But you shouldn't have to go through this at all," she said, her voice breaking slightly. James placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, I shouldn't. But the world is what it is. All we can do is try to make it better." Later that evening, after the kids had gone home and the house was quiet again, James sat in his favorite chair by the window. He reached up and touched the necklace around his neck, the purple heart that Margaret had given him all those years ago. He thought about her, about the life they'd built together, about the battles he'd fought and the ones he was still fighting. The truth was, James Carter didn't need to prove who he was. His service, his sacrifice, his character, those things spoke for themselves. But the fact that he'd been forced to prove it, forced to show a medal just to be treated with basic human decency, that was the real tragedy. Respect isn't something you should have to earn through suffering. It's something every person deserves simply because they're human. And when you judge someone based on the color of their skin, when you make assumptions without knowing their story, you don't just disrespect them. You diminish yourself. James had worn a uniform for his country. He'd bled for his country. He'd lost friends for his country. And yet, in a grocery store parking lot on a quiet Saturday morning, none of that had mattered to a man with a badge who saw only one thing, the color of his skin. But James Carter was more than that. He always had been, and the world was finally starting to see it. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes that book has chapters of courage, sacrifice, and honor that you couldn't even begin to imagine. And sometimes that book served 3 tours in hell so you could have the freedom to make that judgment in the first place. James set his necklace back against his chest, closed his eyes and rested, because tomorrow was another day, and there was still work to be done. This story is a reminder that dignity costs nothing, but prejudice costs everything. James Carter didn't ask to be a hero that day in the parking lot. He just asked to be treated like a human being. And that shouldn't be too much to ask. If stories like this one move you, if they make you think, if they make you want to see a better world, then subscribe. Because we're telling the real-life stories that matter. Stories of injustice, resilience, and the moments when ordinary people remind us what true strength looks like. More stories are coming. Stories that will challenge you, inspire you, and maybe even change the way you see the world. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep this conversation going.